Here's a little primer on resource concepts and terms, particularly as applied to energy resources. And I've used a few little images here to illustrate some of the basics. You see the sun, and you see the rig down here that's oil pumping rig. And then you see the wind turbine, and they're all connected. This is very fossilized, basically solar energy, the products of photosynthesis from millions of years ago. And then winds are created by differences in solar heating, cooling. Um, so a little bit about resources. What are resources in the broadest sense? They're materials or forces in the environment that can be used. Um, they can be thought of, and especially the extractable ones, um, such as oil or gas or coal, can be thought of as reserves. And reserve is where a quantity is of a resource is known and is legally and economically extractable with current technology. And so the whole world's oil resource is one thing, but we don't know where all of that oil is. So the reserve is smaller just because of our knowledge alone. But also, there's certain places that are off limits to drilling, and so those are legally restricted. So that reduces the reserves into a smaller amount or share of all of the resources out there. And then there's the economically extractable piece. There's some oil that is very, very hard to get at and is of low quality, and the amount of money required to extract a barrel of it would not fetch um, a barrel worth of oil. And so in the end, it's not profitable. If it costs more to extract it than you can get for it, then you're not going to do it. So there's lots of oil, for example, out there that's that way. But with current technologies improving, some oils, such as what they call tight oils and shale oils and shale gas and so on, have been we've been able to extract those out of geologic formations where formerly it was just too hard to get them out and it was too expensive. And so fracking is something that has greatly, greatly, greatly expanded the amount of reserves of oil in the United States and other places where that's been done. So that has its own sets of concerns, but that is a pretty good illustration of the importance of technology in changing the size of the reserves. It can make them larger. It can make the resource out there economically extractable in places that it wasn't before. So technology is really, really important in this. And so, there's this old saying, well, we're going to run out of oil. Someday the world won't have any oil left. That'll never happen. But in concept, at least, it could get to the point where there's very little of it left that we could extract at a profit. And by then, we will have probably moved on to other kinds of energy, in my view, hopefully, if you care at all about climate change. So projected reserves are those current ones plus anything that may become reserves due to improved technologies and changing prices. So if prices go up for localized or in a particular time frame, supply and demand changes, it can bring more areas into profitable production potentially, so the reserves can increase. Or if we anticipate some continued improvement in technologies and extractive resources, we can see a large increase in the amount of projected reserves out there. So those are a few kind of extractive resource concepts. For renewable resources now, such as farmland, soil, water, solar, forests, and fisheries, there's a sustainable rate of use that can be no greater than the rate of regeneration. And for a case of solar itself, of course, we can't extract solar energy any more than it's coming from the sun. But with something like farmland, if we use it in an inefficient way, unsustainable way, we can see more erosion than soil formation. And so certain kinds of uses, especially open tillage of hillsides, is very unsustainable. Fisheries have similar concepts, as do forests. There is a kind of sustainable use concept, which is always controversial. How much can we really take out before we degrade the resource? Those sorts of questions. And in the case of fisheries, most of the world's fisheries are unsustainably managed, meaning that they're already below their sustainable rate of yield. The great cod fishery collapse of the North Atlantic is probably the most famous example, but there are many others. So there's renewable resources. The idea of these is that in the case of solar and wind, for example, which is solar based, they are virtually inexhaustible in these concepts of human lifetimes and human memory. So the solar-based ones, as we've mentioned a little bit before, include solar itself, whether it's heating a home passively due to lots of nicely placed windows, warming it up in the winter, but being shaded in the summer by eaves and vegetation. So that's one kind of solar use, a solar thermal. You probably thought that right away I meant solar photovoltaic. That's the solar panels that generate electricity. And indeed, that's the big story in the world today. Then there's wind, which again arises due to differences in pressure between places of different temperature. So the winds are driven, they're essentially a solar-based resource, as is hydropower. The winds, of course, bring the rains and those and snows, and those flow off higher surfaces to lower ones, create hydropower. So all of these are solar-based. I don't have to explain biomass. That's photosynthetic produced fuels potentially, and wave energy is generally most cases by the wind, and the wind is generated by those differences in heating of the sun. So solar-based renewable energy resources. The non-renewable ones, such as fossil fuels, high-grade mineral ore, and fossil groundwater, can they have a sustainable rate of use? So maybe a little explanation. Fossil fuels, again, are coal, oil, natural gas, and those were formed a long, long ago at very slow rates of formation, and we're taking those out of the ground very, very fast in relation to how they form. So in that sense, they're not really used in a sustainable way today at all. But some people have said, well, we could think about their sustainable rate of use if we were willing to start replacing their use by renewables, partly sponsored by the profits from the fossil fuels. That's a kind of controversial thing, but that's been an idea that's been out there since at least the 60s. And of course, the fossil fuel industries would resist that because they wouldn't want their profits being taxed to stimulate the development of competitive sources. So, but something to think about. And essentially, in Europe, that's what they're doing. There's very high energy resource taxes of the fossil fuels in some areas, and some of those have been used for other purposes, not necessarily for reinvesting in renewables, but in some countries you can make the case that to some degree at least that has happened. You could propose, if we really wanted to move to a solar-based economy, that we would tax the use of fossil fuels more and more, so that it would discourage their use and discourage the use of substitutes, such as, say, solar-powered grids that recharge automobiles, or wind power that recharge electric automobiles, that sort of thing. Another view is libertarian, and the libertarian view is that the market supply and demand should shape how we use resources. The immediate problem almost with that point of view is the whole concepts of externalities, where the costs of an economic activity are not directly paid for by the buyers and sellers of the activity, but rather by other people or industries in the present generation or the future. And so this is something that's always been a shortcoming in libertarian ideology, particularly economic libertarian ideology. And neoliberalism, which we in economic geography we talk about, is an example of that. So a lot of times libertarianism it's very embedded in neoliberal thought. So, give an example of an externality. The simplest one doesn't even have to be an energy. Let's say that you own a nice little 5 acre plot of land and you've got a garden on it and your house and maybe some milk cows and maybe a few head of sheep. And so you got a little mini farm. And but there's some you're not far from the suburbs. And so next door on the large span of land, someone buys it and decides they're going to, for the purpose of growing a hog farm with several thousand head of hogs. Well, their use of the land in that form would reduce the value of your land, wouldn't it? Not necessarily the value for farming, but the value of reselling it, say, for residential use. And so that's an external cost that the producer of those hogs isn't necessarily going to reimburse you for the reduced value of your land, or the inconveniences or the horrible smell, either one, which reduces the kind of aesthetic value or intrinsic values of the land itself. So externalities are a big problem, and fossil fuels are a great example of these. Global climate change is what's the main thing we're struggling with right now with the fossil fuel combustion, and a lot of the costs exerted by fossil fuels on societies, flooded island nations, for example, are not being borne by the industries that are extracting and selling those fossil fuels, whether it's oil or coal or natural gas. So, in the concepts of resources, we can think of the sustainable rate of emissions and pollutants, kind of maximum rate at which it can be recycled, absorbed, or rendered harmless by the environment. So, a very significant amount of dilution is necessary, and when you see a smokestack like that, or a steam stack with some pollutants associated with it. One of the reasons we put the big towers up is so that at least some of that gets up into the middle levels of the atmosphere in the area and is carried away and does less harm at the surface. So this is kind of controversial. What is a sustainable rate of emission? So with automobiles, we've really cleaned them up since really the 1970s with catalytic converters and so on. And they're fairly clean, but they still do emit carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And that now has become one of the biggest issues. Smog has always been a problem with automobiles and also industrial pollutants, and it has health costs. And the biggest cost of fossil fuels right now isn't really global climate change. Yeah, might be surprised I would say that. It's actually human health. Somewhere between 4 to 7 million people die prematurely due to particulates in the air from air pollution. And a lot of that is fossil fuel based. Not all, but a lot in some areas. In the United States, that number is much smaller, but it's still probably over 100,000. So I'm going to skip over this little section here. The whole point is just read through it, but this shows you how much energy use in the world has increased through time. Kind of an amazing story in itself. And read about the Anthropocene, just a little bit about that. So you want to click on that link when you look through these notes. So in the area of kind of reviewing carrying capacity in society, you want to go back and have a look at those notes as well. We just recently did that in economic geography, if that's what this video is for. If you're watching this video and it's not economic geography, then forgive me for that, but I may use this again for other purposes. So one of the things that happens with the carrying capacity graphs is that there's a kind of flow of information about a society. I'm going to pull those up and I'll be right back just a second. I'm realizing I'm against some time limits on this video, so we're just going to look at this just briefly, but then we're going to come back to this. And so the timing of the sensing of signals, which is to some degree done by the scientific community, conducted by the scientific community, reported, and then the forces shaping the nature and timing of our responses are really important in seeing how we handle threats such as global climate change. And so science, media, capitalism, public perception, society, politics are all important. And I'd like it, there's probably almost 30 minutes of videos to see here.